Hello and welcome to the beautiful city of Sydney. 200 years ago, a small fleet of 11 vessels sailed into this harbour under the command of Arthur Phillip, the first governor, with a cargo of 750 convicts. They'd come to found a new colony which was to act as a settlement for deported criminals and also to open up the area for agriculture to supply the new colony. They anchored first at Botany Bay, just down the coast, but finding it an exposed landing without a good supply of fresh water, they sailed up to this natural harbour and arrived here on January the 26th, 1788. It was 258 days since they'd left England. The beauty of this harbour and the security it offered so impressed Arthur Phillip that he wrote to Lord Sydney, after whom the harbour is named, and said, "We've had the satisfaction of finding the finest harbour in the world." From that beginning, Sydney has developed into a fine modern city with its opera house and famous harbour bridge and a reputation as a world centre of commerce and trade. Christians from many Sydney churches have gathered in the historic St James's Church to join in this special Songs of Praise to mark the Bicentenary of European settlement here. The first hymn brings together a historic tune with words written in Australia by James Quinn, "Sing, All Creation." The Old Bailey in London was the starting point for many of the early settlers in Australia. It was here that they were sentenced to deportation. John McKnight's ancestors passed through this experience.
Well, initially, it was almost like discovering some sort of treasure in your family. To have a first fleeter in Australia now is quite important. My parents, however, had a different attitude. They were a little bit shocked having convicts in the family tree. But I'm quite proud and quite thrilled.
Has the experience from your past, or at least your family's past, affected the way that you work today?
I think it has had some bearing on the way I have an attitude towards the poor and the underprivileged. We live in the Soho of Australia, a place called King's Cross, and so we have a ministry to marginal people in the parish, to prostitutes, to drug-dependent people, to down-and-outs, people from psychiatric hospitals, and to normal people, tourists and visitors who come to the King's Cross area.
He's actually on a good behaviour bond.
We have a staff of 14, we have quite a large voluntary group. Most of them are part of our congregation, though others come from outside the parish and even outside our own denomination. We have a hostel for young kids who are waiting for the results of their AIDS test and to try and divert them away from a lifestyle which puts them at risk with AIDS.
You've got the bicentennial. How are you celebrating it?
Well, we're celebrating it with a big family reunion. All the descendants of the first couple that came out on the first fleet will be gathering together at some stage. And then, to me, Sydney is the harbour, and so I'll be down around the harbour celebrating around Sydney Harbour.
Now, John, you're going to introduce our next hymn. Tell me about it.
Yes, the next hymn is written by an Australian, Richard Connolly. It's a very popular one in Australia. It has a wonderful tune. It's called Holy Father, God of Might.
Joyce Clegg was brought up on an Aboriginal mission at a time when Aboriginal people had few rights. They've only had a vote since 1967.
Aboriginal people could not own their own home, that was one. They couldn't own livestock, they couldn't own machinery, and of course we were limited also where we could go. We had no form of running water or electricity, it was just living in a tin hut. Rations were given to us, and that of course was limited. Schooling was very restricted, just to drawing and perhaps a little bit of writing. So attitude to white people, I think it was one of fear as far as Aboriginals are concerned in this country. There's no celebration. Not when you consider the massacre, the poisoning, the shooting that was done within the first contact of the white person in this country. So there's no form of celebration. But I would like to use the word more so participation. The Indigenous people of this country have something to give. And we have something to share, recognising occupation of this country for 40, 50,000 years, and recognising also the future.
So who encouraged you not to hate white people?
My grandfather. I think I would hate now, Roger, but for those words that he stated to me. Okay, you can hate what they are doing to you, but never hate them, because hate destroys you.
I believe there's a special story about the hymn you've chosen.
Yes, because my grandparents, and certainly my mother and father, could not read and write, so they memorised the hymns, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and each Sunday we used to always sing that, and because of that I've chosen that hymn.
When the first convict ship arrived in Sydney, the people certainly couldn't expect home comforts, but at least they had spiritual nourishment. The Reverend Richard Johnson travelled with them, and he actually set up the first church in Australia here. He constantly summoned them to prayer, but unfortunately his religious fervour was not met by deep devotion on the part of these early reluctant settlers. Parts of Sydney are still preserved in their original state. Some of the convicts put their skills to work, creating an enduring legacy of churches and public buildings which enhance the city today. The most famous of these is Francis Greenway, who was sentenced to death for forgery and sent to Australia. It's rather ironic that his face now appears on a $10 note, celebrating the fact that he became a very famous architect and actually designed the church where we are today. The next hymn was written by someone whose life went in exactly the opposite direction. Sidney Hugo Nicholson is named after this city. His father Charles emigrated here, and he became one of the founders of the University of Sydney. His son founded the Royal School of Church Music, and doubtless he would have been thrilled at the thought of choirs and a congregation singing one of his famous hymns in a place where his father still remembered. Lift high the cross. Canon Laurie Bartlett was chairman of the editorial committee of the Australian Hymn Book.
I started playing the piano when I was very young, and I've always loved making music and listening to music and ultimately writing music. Everything that went into the book was field tested in the committee. I mean, we sang through everything. If it didn't work, out. And a number of my tunes were simply not accepted, and I accepted their decision willingly, but there are a couple of mine in the book.
In what way is it specifically Australian? You're not singing a lot about kangaroos and wattle and things
No,
like that.
no, we were anxious not to be chauvinistically Australian like that. It is Australian, perhaps not with wattle, but when we come to Christmas, we're not quite so keen on the snow and ice type thing.
Sensible.
And especially when we come to Easter, of course, you see, Easter for us is not in the middle of, in spring. So we had to try to choose Easter hymns that did not depend on the spring metaphors. Then I suppose the fact that Australians put the book together meant that there may be, shall I say, a forthrightness, a directness about the style.
What makes a good hymn from your point of view?
I think that people want a hymn to speak the truth. They want to be able to sing it with their heart as well as with their voice. They want the words to make sense to them, and they want to be able to say those words honestly. Many people have clung on to their understanding of God through hymns in crucial moments of life because those words of poetry and perhaps the tune itself has come back to them.
What about the hymn you've chosen for us?
Seek, O seek the Lord. It speaks to the heart as well as to the mind.
Yvonne Inthachak is a new Australian. She is Vietnamese and came here 10 years ago. She now helps other new migrants to adjust to their new life.
Sometimes I do take these kids out on an outing. We've gone bushwalking. I really enjoy the countryside of this country, and I just find it very rich in many ways. These kids that I work with do not have their parents here, so they need somebody that they can talk to, need somebody that they can be listened to, and somebody that they can confide in. Before I came to this country, I didn't know anything about Australia. I didn't even speak English. It was just really terrifying. I think that probably be the word. I mean, in general, Australian people are very, very open and very concerned and caring toward new Australians, but you'll find a minority that are what I call pretty narrow-minded. Sometimes I see them as racist, and I feel very sad about that. But there's not much I can do but just to overlook it.
When you arrived here, you were a Buddhist. Now you're a Christian. How did that come about?
My foster father was a minister of Church of England, and they really accepted me and cared for me the moment that they met me without knowing me. I was just really touched, by Dad. I just never felt so loved and cared for until I came into that family. And as I said, I didn't know them at all. I didn't do anything to get their love or care, but they just love and care for me for the person that I am.
Tell me about the next hymn.
It's called Do Not Be Afraid. It reminds me that He's my helper, He's my light in my daily walk, and I'm not to be afraid wherever I go or whoever I may be with, because He's always with me.
Gay and Andrew Grant are scripture teachers. They also enjoy life on the legendary Australian beaches.
You can enjoy the warmth of the sun, you can enjoy the coolness of the sea, and it's a really changing place as well. There's many moods of the sea. It can be wild and raging, and it can be very peaceful and calming.
Teaching scripture is something that you can't just go in and pump things down their throat, and I think it's very important that they see that we're normal people, that we can appreciate things that they appreciate, but at the same time have a deeper love to perhaps bring about a better world in that sense, and in that way we can tie the two together.
Would you say that you felt you could have influence as a Christian within the surfing world?
I think surfing can sometimes become an end in itself, that people think that that will bring meaning in their life and almost worship it, which can be a dangerous thing.
And it's something which we hope we can show to our friends who are in the surfing culture, show them that we're not just in it for the sake of it, and we're not just trying to do it for ourselves, but that we are appreciating the creator rather than, the sport itself. I think it helps us to relate to normal people, helps us to feel that we're part of the regular culture, we're not part of some special Christian culture.
I think church can become a sense of security in itself, just no better than drugs or sex or anything else that other people worship. And I think it's a matter of either reading the Bible till it stands out, the compassion and love of Jesus for the other people, or getting out on the streets until you can feel the brokenness and the hurt of the people that are crying out for something. Whether it be here with the upper class people that have everything, that are still looking and are broken inside, they're torn apart, or whether it be the people down on the down on the streets and the gutters that have been the outcasts of society.
What hymn have you chosen?
We've chosen the one, Lord of all creation. It talks about, I suppose, the tension of having the freedom and beauty of this world, but also the hurts and the hopes that this world carries.
And it reminds us of the beauty of Australia and the beauty of the land, and yet still how much there is that we need to grow and learn.
Lord God, you have drawn us to this great South land by your Holy Spirit. Breathe into our nation and into our hearts the true spirit of faithfulness and of love, that as we give you thanks for 200 years of Christian life in this country, we may dedicate ourselves afresh to work together for the extension of your kingdom. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be among you and remain with you always. Amen. Amen.
Good morning. For you in Britain, it's just midnight. Here in Sydney, it's 11 a.m. on a bright, sunny, happy morning. A very important morning for Australia. It's the 200th birthday of the arrival of the first fleet from England at the start of the Australia that we know today. So let's join the biggest birthday party that Australia has known. In a short while, in fact they're due there now, the Prince and Princess of Wales are due to arrive at the Opera House for the big ceremony. And of course also there will be the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Bob Hawke, and his wife, and various governors and dignitaries and premiers and all the rest of it for the big day. And they're waiting now at Man o' War Steps, just below the Opera House. Man o' War Steps, which of course is where so many people in the Australian Navy and the Royal Navy have set sail to go to war. And the Prince and Princess of Wales are there, the Princess of Wales in green today, green and white. They shake hands. They were here, of course, yesterday when they handed over Britain's gift to Australia on this particular celebration. And that was the sail training ship, the Young Endeavour, which is now in the Royal Australian Navy. Mr. Bob Hawke, his wife Hazel, and all the other dignitaries, all the governors of the individual states are here, the premiers are here, and it is Australia's big day, 200 years on from when the first fleet arrived. Well, here with us now is Mr. Malcolm Turnbull, the Sydney lawyer, who's not exactly unknown to Her Majesty's government in London over the Spycatcher case. Now, Malcolm, you are a Sydney sider. Is it a good turnout today?
It's an enormous turnout. It's interesting, Alistair. The Bicentennial was the subject of a lot of scepticism, particularly last year, and it became a very political issue, people accusing the government of being over-extravagant. But I think the people have really become excited about it now, and it's going to be a huge success.
Now, Mr. Hawke quite likes celebrations. He quite likes Sydney, doesn't he?
Yes, he does, although he's originally from Perth and has his electorate in Melbourne. But he's fond of Sydney, and he has a very nice house just across the harbour, the Kirribilli House, which we can't quite see from here, which looks directly over to the Opera House.
Well, now they're all the dignitaries making their way to the Opera House from Man o' War Steps for the ceremony to begin. We're going to have speeches. Of course, you'll have to have speeches on an occasion like this, but we'll also have quite a bit of music, many of the tunes which came from Old England, Old Wales, Old Scotland, and indeed Old Ireland. And so the Prince and Princess arrive with the Governor-General, Mr. Hawke, of course, always a very distinctive figure. And anybody who's anybody is here today. It's all being held out in the open air, which is a very considerable vote of confidence in Sydney's weather, but it's entirely justified today. They come to the steps of the Opera House, built really on an Aztec or Mayan system, and well known, of course, around the world as Sydney's most modern symbol, after the old harbour bridge. And there are the crowds of Sydney siders, and many of them queued in the past just to get tickets. And this is the occasion when the whole of Australia is looking at Sydney, even Melbourne is looking at Sydney, and the whole of the world is enjoying Australia's 200th birthday. So we're going now to the saluting base, the saluting point for the Royal Salute. In a very diplomatic way, we've had God Save the Queen, and we've also had Advance Australia Fair. Well, now the main business of the morning, the musical business anyway, will be by the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, the Sydney Philharmonia, the choir, and the 2nd Military District Band. We've already heard from them. The band were told that if it were wet, only they would be the people who would play. But of course, it has worked out extremely well, and accompanied by the Governor-General, Sir Ninian Stephen, the Prince and Princess now make their way to the decks. There was quite a bash at the Opera House last night. Inside, this is entirely in the open air. So marching and counter-marching before 4,000 guests assembled here, and of course many more perched on other parts of the Opera House, looking out at the harbour and looking out at the ships. Well, of course, Sydney has been up early today. There have been many sights and sounds already. So we're going to show you what you may have missed there in Britain. Here's Sydney's morning.
Well, a little while ago, the great celebration was already not quite going according to plan, and the First Fleet was only making slow progress past the Heads, hampered by an extraordinary gathering of Sydney's boats, most of whom went out to sea to greet the fleet instead of waiting in the harbour. This hadn't been expected and worried the authorities for a while. They thought the ceremony might have to start before the fleet had reached Farm Cove, making it a bit like Hamlet without the prince. The wind wasn't the favourable nor'easter that had been expected, and the fleet had to take in sail and slow down. Still, you have to remember the original fleet only managed a speed of 3 knots. This is Bounty, a fully rigged 3-master, built in New Zealand as a replica of the 1787 Bounty for a remake of the movie. And this is Eye of the Wind, a tan-sailed 2-masted brig, skippered by a man with the delightful name of Captain Tiger Timms. And this is what the sailors of the First Fleet saw as they approached harbour, Sydney's greatest welcome for perhaps her greatest day. The Prince and Princess of Wales boarded the Admiral's barge at Woolloomooloo to sail to Farm Cove, the Princess in large sunglasses against the glare. She did get a bit of a burn yesterday. So, only just a fraction late, the ceremony was about to begin.
Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chairman of the New South Wales Bicentennial Council, Mr. Gerald Gleeson. Your Excellencies, Your Royal Highnesses,
Mr. Jerry Gleeson, to have his say and to say why and how and by what means everybody has been assembled. Well, now, Malcolm, 200 years and 200 years of the British connection. How long do you think that's likely to last?
Well, I don't think we can ever get away from the fact that this country is closest historical, cultural links are with Britain. I think we'll always have a British connection, whether we always have the Union Jack on our flag and whether we always have the Queen of England as the head of Australia is another question. I don't think that'll be the case in 200 years.
And of course, Prince Charles at one time perhaps had at the back of his mind that he would like to be Governor-General, like his uncle Henry was. That has never come about.
No, I think it's arguably a great pity that it hasn't for Charles's sake, because I think that one of the things that a ceremony like this brings out is that it is essentially an Australian day, and yet our chief guests, Prince Charles and Princess Diana, are not by any stretch of the imagination Australian.
Of course, when the Federation was first founded, I think it was Arthur Balfour, then in power in Britain, who insisted that King Edward VII should send out his son and heir to be present because he valued the connection so much. And I suppose Prince Charles and Princess Diana are following in that line today.
Yes, it is, however, unquestionable, though, that as Australia sees itself as an independent country and not part of the British Empire or part of the British Commonwealth, the link with the royal family becomes more tenuous.
So you would give it what, another generation?
Quite frankly, I think that the Queen, the King or Queen of Britain will cease to be the King or Queen of Australia after Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II ceases to be Queen. I think at that time, which hopefully will be postponed for many years to come, I think that's when Australia will adopt a republican system of government.
But of course, when it comes to constitutional change in Australia, you've always turned out to be pretty conservative, haven't you? A number of prime ministers have had ideas of change actually thrown out by the electorate.
Yes, well, it is a very, it's a difficult, you have to get a majority of votes in a majority of the states, which means 4 out of 6 states, so it is quite hard, but it's being seen increasingly as an irrelevance, I'm afraid.
Well, it's still, I suppose, a great day, and if you are saying it is the end of the British connection, Mr. Hawke appears to be enjoying the occasion, and so does the British High Commissioner. Mr. Hawke was particularly warm in his remarks last night, yesterday afternoon, in fact, in the handing over of the Young Endeavour, the sail trading ship from Britain.
Look, you mustn't think there is any hostility to Britain in Australia. There isn't. There is nothing but fondness. But the question is, should Australia have the same relationship to Britain as it does now, or should it be rather like the United States, which is as staunch an ally as Britain could ever ask for, but would nonetheless not dream of having a foreigner as its head of state? That's the only issue. I hope the royal family will always visit Australia, because they'll always be welcome, regardless of the constitutional position.
Well, there's Mr. Gleeson, and he gets his well-merited applause, not, I suspect, so much for the speech as for all the organisation that has gone into this particular occasion. And you talk about the Americans. Of course, you were once closer to the Americans than you are today, and there have been perhaps second thoughts in Australia about that connection.
Well, I think, I don't know about that, Alistair. I think that there's been some differences of opinion about the extent to which we should cooperate with some of their nuclear weapons programs, but the bond between Australia and America and Australia and Britain is so close as to be almost indissoluble.
I see now that we have the fire ships out in force to greet the new First Fleet, and the new First Fleet, unlike the earlier one, comes rather sponsored. I think almost every ship has got its own advertising, rather unlike the very First Fleet of all, which Malcolm was only sponsored by the British Home Secretary.
Oh, indeed, that's right. That's right. And no matter how harsh the conditions were on this reenactment fleet, they were a lot harsher on the first one.
It has indeed been quite a private enterprise show, I think, this reactivated First Fleet. And Dr. Jonathan King, who's descended from a former governor, indeed from an officer who was in the very First Fleet, has fought long and hard and sometimes noisily in order to bring all this about.
Yes, there was a great deal of reservation amongst the bicentennial authorities about the First Fleet, because the fear was that reenacting the landing of the First Fleet would further annoy the Aboriginals, who are, of course, regard this bicentenary as a day of mourning, because they say it celebrates 200 years of persecution of the Aborigines in Australia.
Well, now we have the Archbishop of Sydney, the Most Reverend Donald Robinson.
We thank you on this memorable day for the land which is our home, for our life together as a nation, and for all your benefits towards us throughout 200 years. We acknowledge our many failures and pray for grace to amend what is at fault in public and in private life. Give us compassion for those among us who do not share appropriately in the bounty and prosperity of this land. Help us to respect each other as brothers and sisters made in your image, to love our neighbour as ourselves, to welcome the stranger, support the weak, to seek the common good, and to honour your name and your word above all things. We thank you for all who have gone before us, who through their toil and sacrifices have fashioned our heritage of faith and freedom. Give us unity of purpose to serve you and all our fellows in Australia and in the world, and grant us a vision of that heavenly commonwealth which is our true home. We offer this prayer in the name of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord. Amen.
Down at Mrs. Macquarie's Point, the Aboriginals who have come to watch and to mourn, they say, this day, are able to hear. Well, now we have the bicentennial hymn, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, the Philharmonia, the conductor William Reed, and again Joan Carden is the soloist. the bicentennial hymn, which of course is being relayed to other parts of the harbour. People are sitting in the sun, enjoying themselves, waiting for what's coming next. That includes some more speeches and, of course, the arrival of the First Fleet. So we'll be back in just a few moments. And so the new First Fleet is making its way up Port Jackson, getting quite close now to Garden Island and not too far off Farm Cove, which is where they'll drop anchor after a very successful voyage. Tony Carthew's on the roof. Tony, what can you see there?
At the moment I can see just about everything. The First Fleet, as you say, is approaching us with a reasonable amount of speed. 3 knots is quite reasonable for them. There's nothing wrong with that. And the tall ships, of course, are behind me. I have to tell you, Alistair, in fact, that I did have a choice today. I could be here for these tremendously important events, or I did have an invitation to go to Alice Springs in the red heart of Australia to attend a national attempt on a piano smashing record. Now, as we speak at this very moment, this is going on. It was also to be followed by strawberries for lunch and 4X beer, but I declined it. My heart and mind said I should be here, and I'm very pleased indeed. Australia has done itself proud. It is a quite superb sight this morning. Alistair.
Which best defines what it means to be an Australian in 1988. For let us ask ourselves on this day of all days, what is it that links us in this generation with the generations that have gone before? It is not only the fact that for the past 200 years and to this day we have been a nation of immigrants. It is not only the fact that we share together this vast continent as our homeland. It is not only the shared inheritance of all that has been built here and achieved here over the past 200 years. And it is not only the common bond of institutions, standards, language and culture. Indeed, in today's Australia, our very diversity is an ever-growing source of a richness, vitality and the strength of our community. It is true that all these things that I've mentioned go to shape the Australian character and to define the Australian identity. Yet, beyond them, there remains one vital factor in the answer to the question, who is an Australian? And that factor is a commitment to Australia and to its future. It is that common commitment which binds the Australian born of the 7th or 8th generation and all those of their fellow Australians born in any of the 130 countries from which our people are drawn. In Australia, there is no hierarchy of descent. There must be no privilege of origin. The commitment is all. The commitment to Australia is the one thing needful to be a true Australian. And today, my fellow Australians, at this historic place and at this historic hour, let us all renew that commitment. Our commitment to Australia and to Australia's cause, the cause of freedom, fairness, justice and peace.
Mr. Bob Hawke speaking to 2 audiences. The white audience celebrating now, and the black audience, the Aboriginal audience, listening to him. Mr. Hawke promised a contract or an arrangement with the Aborigines last year. He is still to deliver. Now, the Prince of Wales.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my wife and I are delighted to be able to return to Australia at this very special time to celebrate with you your nation's bicentennial. It is a historic and splendid occasion for all of us, not only here in Australia, but all over the world, and not least in the United Kingdom. The modern nation of Australia began here 200 years ago today. They were harsh beginnings, and the people who were sent here against their will had little cause to rejoice. And all that was just yesterday. As history goes, 200 years is barely a heartbeat. Yet look around you and see what has happened in that time. A whole new free people. The people of a whole new free country, Australia. If it takes regular visitors from an old country to help you decide whether you should be celebrating or not, my wife and I will be glad to be of assistance. We are both very happy to have been invited to the party. When Captain Cook discovered this part of the great Southland and claimed it for the British Crown, he was sailing in quest of knowledge. And whatever is said about the founding of the British Empire, the astonishing courage and resolve of many people like Captain Cook, who dramatically advanced the sum of human knowledge in their quest for discovery and trade, should not be ignored amidst the less worthy aspects of the story. But as still happens today, when knowledge is invariably examined for its less exalted applications, King George III's ministers fairly soon saw the practical possibilities of a place where inconvenient people could be transported and forgotten. There is no point now in trying to gloss over the circumstances in which the country of which you are rightly proud began. Indeed, to face those facts is a necessary part of realizing just how proud you should be. For the sad truth is that in those early days of the colony, nobody was free. The men who guarded the convicts were in prison along with them. They were all a long way from home, and they all, no doubt, thought that Australia was the worst place in the world. But the best part about the story is that they made their prison into a new home, where freedom became not just the dream of those in shackles, but a reality for everybody. It didn't happen by accident. It took the intelligence and courage of brave men and women. Even within the astonishingly brief span which covers the whole history of modern Australia, the process of making liberty an institution took time. For the original people of this land, it must all have seemed very different. And if they should say that their predicament has not yet ended, it would be hard to know how to answer, beyond suggesting that a country free enough to examine its own conscience is a land worth living in, a nation to be envied. Anyway, most people who live here now seem to think Australia is the best place in the world, and the rest of the world finds it difficult to argue. By now, almost every country on earth is the old country to some family in Australia. Coming from your first old country and celebrating the 22nd anniversary to the month of my first transportation to Australia, let me say on behalf of all the lands and peoples who have contributed to your heritage that you have the best of us. Australia is its own creation, but in a very real sense, it belongs to the world. Australia is an international nation. People from anywhere feel at home here in Australia. It's that sort of place. In 2 world wars, Australians fought wholeheartedly against intolerance and tyranny. They didn't just fight for the old empire, which has now receded into history. They fought for freedom, which lasts if it is looked after and nurtured. One of Australia's oldest ties with the oldest of its old countries is the rule of law. They were harsh judges who sent the first Australians out here, but they were wisely framed laws that turned the convicts into free men and women. And free men and women helped make a democracy which has become a model for the world. They didn't do it just by being good-natured and easygoing, however famous they were, and you are for those qualities. They did it by carefully writing down the laws of a reasonable and humane society. The spirit of liberty that they felt within themselves, they made legible to others. The true celebration of this nation is in its constitution, in those dry-sounding but hard fought-for rules and regulations. Every family in this remarkable country has its rights protected and cherished. As it happened so long ago, many of you may not realize that part of my own education took place here in Australia. Quite frankly, it was by far the best part, and something which I shall always cherish. It gave me an insight into the character of this country and the individuals who have shaped it by the force of their personalities and by their infectious good humor. While I was here, I had the pommy bits bashed off me, like chips off an old block, and the results are only too obvious. I keep coming back for more, and it is always a special pleasure. But my wife and I are particularly glad to be here this year, on this great day, to help you, as if the Aussies needed help in anything, to celebrate your good fortune, and to wish you well for a future that holds out such great promise.
The Prince of Wales, from the oldest of Australia's old countries, recalling his youth and saluting the new Australia as the First Fleet, the reenacted First Fleet, which produced the first European Australia, approaches Farm Cove. Malcolm, you followed the diplomacy in Mr. Hawke's speech and Prince Charles's speech.
Yes, it was both very fine speeches. Just getting back to what we were talking about earlier, you see the Prince Charles referred to Australia as your nation. He referred to himself as coming from an old country. And this is the problem. Loved though he is, Prince Charles is not one of us, nor does he purport to be.
And Mr. Hawke, how do you think the Aboriginal listeners will have thought about what he said about Australia's future?
Well, I don't think they can be satisfied. I think, frankly, the Aboriginals, the problem the Aboriginals have is that their demands cannot ever be satisfied, really.
Well, now we have the reenacted First Fleet arriving in Farm Cove, their designated harbour, after 8 months of voyaging, starting from Portsmouth, where the Queen sent them off. They went following the tracks of the original First Fleet to Tenerife, to Rio de Janeiro, to Cape Town, and then actually putting in a stop, which the First Fleet didn't actually use, Mauritius. They were very well entertained. And now they come. Soren Larsen, the brigantine, the flagship, R. Tucker Thompson from New Zealand, R. Svannon from Canada, Anna Christina from Norway, one and all Australian. And they make their way through a myriad of boats. What's remarkable is the Piccadilly Circus of the world on water. Terry Carthew, above Farm Cove. Are they within eyesight now?
They are indeed, and I would think, you know, Alistair, the crews are just a little relieved. They've done 21,000 nautical miles. That is a very, very long way in what are sometimes described on some of the ships as luxurious conditions, but even so, it's a very, very hard thing to do, and I think they've done it splendidly. On the flagship, for example, the Søren Larsen, it's distinguished in many ways, but for having the oldest and the youngest passengers. The oldest is a 72-year-old, Mrs. Anne von Bertusch from Newcastle. She may actually recognize something faintly familiar about the bridge ahead of her. And the youngest, 3-year-old Natasha Davis, is the wife of the skipper, Anthony Davis. It must be a very exciting day for her and for her father to have brought this amazing journey to completion and to receive this sort of welcome, which even by Sydney standards is really quite something. Alistair.
Well, Tony, as advertising is the order of the day, and who can blame them, because they had to raise the funds in order to get here, and they've given their own time to it. Of course, we should say the Sydney Harbour Bridge was built by Dorman Long from the northeast coast of England. It was designed by an Australian, but we'll forget that for the moment. Anyhow, they're taking the advertising down now, taking in a reef, and that does mean that this newest of the first fleets is just entering Farm Cove. It's called Farm Cove because, well, that was the very first farm which was set up by Governor Phillip when they arrived, and it was the farm, Australia's first agricultural disaster. It didn't work, the soil was far too sandy, they had the wrong seeds, it was the wrong time of year, they were all in great difficulty from scurvy and all the rest of it, and they were just a little bit too high and mighty to follow the Aboriginal ways, the berries, the fruits that the Aboriginals ate and kept them in trim. But it was a European invasion. At least that's what the Aboriginals would say. And on the right of the picture is Mrs. Macquarie's Point. She was the wife of an early governor, and that's where the Aboriginal mission, the Aboriginal protest, they've been camping out there over the past week now. In town, inside Sydney, there's to be an Aboriginal march from the suburb of Redfern to Hyde Park. Unfortunately, one of the war memorials there has already been defaced. So that's another side to this ceremonial. But now, the crew are busy, the sails are furled, and it's harbour and haven. Tony, have you been hearing the stories about dissatisfaction in the new First Fleet, that they haven't been honoured enough?
Yes, there is a certain problem as between the people of the First Fleet and the people who have been sailing in the tall ships. This enormous fleet of tall ships, 174 of them, biggest thing ever seen in the Southern Hemisphere. They seem to have been invited to everything, whereas the poor old First Fleeters have been stuck on their respective boats in Botany Bay since the 18th of this month, what, 8-9 days. Not allowed off, water brought out to them, which may, of course, recreate the original conditions, but perhaps not in the way that they'd intended. I also wonder, you know, Alistair, what Captain Phillip himself would have thought about today when he looks at this kind of thing. What has happened to the colony that he dropped anchor in the HMS Sirius, took out his King's orders. His Majesty has commanded that all due steps be taken to resume the practice of transportation, as was hitherto the case before the recent conflict in America, and to set sail to the territory of New South Wales upon the coast of New Holland, where you will establish His Majesty's possession of the territory. That he did. This is what we see, what the Australians have done with it. Of course, there is that one point. It was New Holland for the first 30 years. And Australia became Australia in 1817. Alistair.
Well, Terry, it was Prince Charles who said that he'd been first transported to Australia to go to school. This is the right moment to look at Captain Governor Phillips's First Fleet. Arthur Phillip, commander of the First Fleet, first governor of New South Wales. Humanist, idealist, reformer. His fleet of 11 ships carrying 1,300 people, convicts and marines, sailed first from Portsmouth to Tenerife. And there were attempts at rebellion and escapes, floggings, deaths and births. The flagship, the Sirius, just 540 tons and mounting 20 guns. The Navy had bought her on the cheap. The other warship, the Supply, just a tender, only 170 tons, said to be very improper for such a voyage. The second leg to Rio de Janeiro. A counterfeiter was caught. Trouble with the women convicts sleeping with the men. More floggings. But Rio made them welcome. The governor was gracious. The officers studied the local ladies. They also studied quietly the Portuguese fortifications in the harbour. The third leg, Rio to Cape Town, just 39 days. Convicts tried to seize the transport Alexander. Many more floggings. They anchored under Table Mountain, but the Dutch weren't happy to see them and were slow with supplies. They took on 30 sheep, which a marine said would be more agreeable shipmates than the women. The last leg, 68 days to Botany Bay, round the south of Tasmania, which everyone thought then was attached to Australia. The wind was against them. The seas were high. Drunkenness among the convicts, even more floggings. At last the land, not Botany Bay, the governor didn't like the look of it, but Sydney Cove in Port Jackson. Jackson was an Admiralty clerk, Sydney was the Home Secretary who'd put up the money for the trip. It was tense for all at first, but in the end they managed a decent place for the governor. But they found they couldn't grow things from European seed. They nearly starved. The Sirius had gone back to Cape Town for supplies, but off Norfolk Island, the settlement for tough prisoners, she was wrecked. It was a bad blow. It needed the second and third fleets to save the colony. They found themselves in a natural history museum. Animals like the kangaroo, which had survived after the sea cut off the continent from the rest of the world. And the emu. These were creatures that naturalists in England were slow to believe in, especially the size of the emu's egg, but they were fascinated. The first little body of a duck-billed platypus to reach England. The scientists thought it a hoax, a beak on a quadruped. Poor platypus, he had been real all right. And they tried with suitable precautions to get to know the natives, something that modern Australians were slower to do. Sir Sidney Nolan, the best known of Australia's modern painters.
I grew up in Australia without ever seeing an Aborigine, and was told at school that they were Stone Age people and extremely primitive and practically from the moon, from another planet. We actually never saw any. We would have been better off if we'd understood that they were a tremendously subtle and ancient people who'd successfully lived for 40,000 years with an organized society which is perfectly adapted to its environment, which is an extremely harsh environment, and they had made a very good job of it.
Governor Phillip, who believed in friendliness, got speared. He'd held out his hand. An Aborigine thought he meant harm. He recovered. He ordered no retaliation. The saddest and maybe the truest figure of all, Bennelong, the Aborigine captured, befriended, taken to England for show. When he got back to Sydney, he threw off his London clothes and escaped to the bush. On the point in Sydney Harbour named after him, they built the Opera House. And he also took to drink. Now we have the fly past, 150 planes, some of them fixed wing, some of them helicopters, are to come right across Port Jackson, which is of course Sydney Harbour, and celebrate. This is the big moment of all the three Australian services, but perhaps especially now of the RAAF, the Royal Australian Air Force. Well, coming in now plainly are the helicopters. The Navy helicopters had their big day on Friday when they flew right up to Sydney Harbour Bridge and showed the Australian white ensign. No doubt quite a bit of a recruiting drive. The problem with fly-pasts, I always think, with modern aircraft, and especially with jets, is now you see them, now you don't. But the choppers now from all three Australian services and gathered from all parts of the continent are here on time to entertain the crowds and to show Australia's Air Force and other services' strength. Comes actually at a moment when the retired Air Marshal in Australia is saying that Australia's defences and its radar up in the north of the country are not really strong enough to be able to detect not just the Russians who may be flying over reconnaissance flights from what used to be Indochina, from Cam Bay, but also really unable to protect Australia from some of the drug runners who use airstrips, airstrips which were built in the Second World War to bring in drugs and sometimes illegal immigrants in the north. So this will be a bit of a reassurance. But here we are, the helicopter, something, an airplane which just wasn't invented. It didn't fly or fight in the Second World War, above the recreated First Fleet of the Royal Navy, which held the seas and to whom the foundation of Australia is effectively and militarily responsible. So here they come, and these are the ones which we can actually see. You can always watch steeplechase horses, but the sprinters are difficult. Squirrels, Sea Kings, Wessexes, Bells, Kiowas, Porters, Nomads, coming all the way through. 15 from the Royal Australian Navy, 15 from the Army, and 38 from the RAAF. So the fly past has begun and goes on now right across Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is about the one bit of road work in central Sydney which is still open today. The rest of the town has been, well, really sealed off, but you can come by your boat, but you could also come free by train or bus, any way you like. This is Australia's great day, 200th anniversary. And so they swing away over the city, away from the watcher's eyes. Well, we'll be coming back for the next part of the celebration. We got some music to come back. We've got some daylight fireworks. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. Jackson, or Sydney Harbour. The helicopters have left us. Now we're in with the fixed-wing boys, coming chiefly from, of course, the RAAF, who are coming in over the, we reckon, 2,500 small craft yachts. You name it, it's here in Sydney Harbour. And here they come. Well, I said fixed-wing, of course, since we're going to be seeing some F-111Cs, they're swing-wing. But here we come now, HS-148s, Orions, C-130s, and so on, brought in from all parts of the continent. New South Wales, South Australia, up north in Queensland, some coming, the Mirages, who will be on their way shortly, coming from Darwin in the Northern Territory. Well, now, Malcolm, there has been some controversy about Australia's ability to defend itself, and in particular, the air defences, which in the old days, John Curtin, the former Labour Prime Minister, said was the only way to defend Australia. How do you regard that? Do you think Australia is defensible on its own?
Well, it depends. Defensible against who? It's obviously not defensible on its own against an attack from a major superpower like the Soviet Union. But although one would be excused for thinking it was, looking at the Air Force coming past, they're very grand. But our defence strategy really has to be aimed at defending the country against smaller regional powers, such as Indonesia, for example.
Yes, you had trouble with them, didn't you, dealing with some of the islands?
Yes, there's been a history of tension because Indonesia has occupied half of New Guinea, and in fact incorporated half of New Guinea into its own country. And there has been a degree of tension between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, which is a country that Australia has very close links with, obviously.
Well, now we've got some fighters, and I think if this is being shown on television in Jakarta and Surabaya and so on, they're meant to be impressed.
Well, I hope so. I hope they are. Yeah.
I think many people watching in Britain now may well remember that during the last war, an awful lot of British pilots and observers were trained in Australia using the blue skies and today's kind of weather. Although, I think we have to say, in rather slower and less noisy aircraft.
Yes, indeed.
And so the fly past continues. and they roar by over the harbour bridge, an earlier technology. This part of today's celebrations had to be absolutely spot on, because they had to come from airports, aerodromes, air bases all across the continent. Well, now we're going to be privileged to hear Waltzing Matilda as it should be played, the unofficial Australian national anthem. It was actually the words by Banjo Patterson that was first sung in a hotel up north in Queensland in 1895. Joan Carden sings it now. Well, the valiant efforts of Joan Carden, the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, the Philharmonia Choir, applauded there by the Princess of Wales and the military band, and William Reid, the conductor, rather interrupted at the start, at any rate, by what are known as daylight fireworks. And what's happening is that from all around Farm Cove, where the First Fleet, the reenacted First Fleet, is anchoring, flags, 88, 100, you name them, are being thrown up into the air. Flags of Australia, of the various states and territories, and indeed any flag you wish to mention. If you wish to have it thrown up in the air over Farm Cove, Sydney, you've had your wish now. These are daytime fireworks. Sounds like a contradiction in terms. First daytime fireworks used by James VI in London, England, off Greenwich, at the marriage of his daughter, who became the Queen of Bohemia. Don't know, Malcolm, whether you think daytime fireworks are a good idea. Are they just an Australian reinvention?
No, I think they're splendid. When my wife told me we were going to have daylight fireworks, I told her she was completely mad and such things weren't possible. So I've been proved wrong too.
Well, it's another success then for the Bicentennial or Bicentenary Committee. And now I think we know that Australia Post, which is a nationalised industry, so we can mention it, which sponsors the Bounty. This is the reconstruction of the Bounty, which starred in Mutiny on the Bounty, the most recent one. And of course we should mention now that Governor Bligh was a governor of Australia. He had a mutiny on the Bounty. I'm right in saying, Malcolm, he had a mutiny here in Sydney. I think
yes.
the military in Sydney couldn't stand him. They deposed him and he hid under his bed.
That's right. He was very important because he protected the small settlers, amongst whom were my forebears, against the rather rapacious military establishment here. And a lot of the small settlers, Scottish Presbyterian settlers mainly, signed a petition which they sent to London. And as a mark of their devotion, many of their descendants have Bligh as their middle name. I'm in fact the 6th Turnbull to have his middle name Bligh. So it's, I have somewhat of a link to the Bounty.
So it's nearly your 200th birthday.
Not quite. No, the first Turnbull got here in 1802, so...
Now we're hearing the national anthems on the departure of the Prince and Princess. So it's a great day for the armed forces of Australia and for everybody in, around, and maybe 1,000 miles around Sydney Harbour, and also watching in Britain as the Prince and Princess and their party leave the dais on the steps of the new Sydney Opera House to make their way back to Man of War Steps, and then they'll cross the harbour to go first to Admiralty House at Kirribilli on the other side, and then they'll come round to Circular Quay for lunch. Circular Quay with its newly rebuilt passenger terminal, where Australia is attracting and hopes to continue to attract the big cruise liners, Princess of the Seas, QE2, and so on. And the Princess, I've no doubt that her rig out, green and white, will be featuring in all the papers here in the city tomorrow and elsewhere around the world. The party makes their way towards Man of War Steps. The ceremony, the hymn, the service, waltzing Matilda, and indeed we've also had, just to show Australia's true origins, songs from England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and the daylight fireworks. Whether there'll be daylight fireworks and what they'll look like on the 3rd centenary, not quite sure, Malcolm.
No, I think we can only speculate on the tricentenary. Neither of us will be here to see it, I fear.
Oh, I don't know. I think medical science keeps a lot of people going these days. I can't believe that Australian inventions in that part of the world are not going to help us. Well, so here is the triumphant end of the voyage of the First Fleet. Began, as we were saying, the Queen herself sent them off from Portsmouth, and they were royally entertained en route. Now they have made it, not without casualties. Men were washed overboard, couldn't be recovered, so it's been a journey of courage, it's been a journey of sacrifice in order to come here in order to recall to Australia and to the world Australia's origins. And I think this is the right time to give credit not only to Dr. Jonathan King, who is the invigorating force behind it all, but to Fleet Commodore Michael Kitchenside and Soren Larsen, Vice Commodore Ken Edwards and R. Svannon, who have completed this voyage. One of the important things about the very first fleet, under Captain Phillip, later Governor Phillip, was that although it took 8 months on the way, it was very badly organized and all the rest of it, the actual losses through disease and so on in the course of that journey were not great. They were a tribute to medical science in the 18th century and were very, very much fewer than the second fleet, which came out afterwards. And I think we now, of course, should say to you, it's not just Sydney that's celebrating. We're now in Canberra, the federal capital. Prime Minister Mr. Hawke, of course, is with us in Sydney at the moment. But Canberra is also celebrating with another military parade and the proper sort of applause. All around Australia. In 1938, which was the 150th anniversary, it was really only New South Wales and Sydney that celebrated. The other states, well, just possibly drew their skirts in a bit and said that must be a Sydney occasion. But now in Sydney, and we're overlooking Government House, where the Prince and Princess of Wales are staying, which itself is on the very edge of Farm Cove, where the renewed First Fleet is now anchoring. Government House does remind one that, of course, it's Gothic revival. It reminds one of the 19th century and of the very strong British connection of those days. The architect there, Edward Blore, was in fact one of Queen Victoria's architects at Windsor and indeed in London. But after 200 years, it may well be that in sentiment and nostalgia, the British sort of Australia has now gone. Malcolm, perhaps the break with Britain came, what, around about 1942, when Britain was really so engaged in defending itself in its corner of northwest Europe, and the Japanese were in the war, and Australia was left on its own, virtually with only about 30,000 troops.
Yes, indeed. Most of our army was in the Middle East, fighting the Germans and the Italians, and had to come back to Southeast Asia to defend Australia. I think it's been a slower thing than that, Alistair. Britain's entry into the common market, of course, was a very significant event, because it meant that Australia no longer had a sort of free trade arrangement with Britain, and that, just as Australia was cast alone from Britain in defence terms in the Second World War, so it was in economic terms when Britain entered the European community.
And you now have a very important program to develop your trade with Asia. The other day, one of your ministers was saying that it was time that Australian children stopped learning so many European languages and began to learn the languages of Southeast Asia, China and Japan.
Well, that's true, and that's something that Gough Whitlam's been pushing for a long time too. We have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that we're a European nation, or largely European nation, living in Asia.
And so again, Port Jackson, discovered by Captain Cook, preferred by Governor Phillip for the new colony, has had yet another great day. And with the replica of the Bounty there, with all the swarm of small craft now leaving man-of-war steps and on their way just across the harbour to Admiralty House, from where the Prince and Princess will leave again and go to the main and the new passenger terminal. It's another chapter in the history of Port Jackson. Jackson, in fact, was an Admiralty clerk, and it was just as a little gesture of friendship that Captain Cook named the place after him. It was commonly supposed in Britain that the name of this colony at its institution was Botany Bay. It took about 50 years for English and Scottish journalists to forget that. It's commonly supposed, too, that the very first colony which was established here was called Sydney. It wasn't. They actually wanted to call it Albion, but the cove was Sydney Cove, and it was the name of Sydney which survived. He was the Home Secretary at the time who put up the money to remove the convicts from Britain. But at the same time, it was thought that this could be a most useful naval base for the British against the French, who had frigates and other expeditions in the southern seas, and perhaps even against the Dutch. It may well be that Sydney Harbour itself was first discovered by Portuguese, but the Portuguese were so secretive that they've never really claimed it. So, Prince and Princess and their party go on their way. Royal Australian Navy barge, making good progress towards Kirribilli. It's a harbour. Well, almost everyone has come to Sydney Harbour at some time in their lives. The whalers, the sealers, the dealers in sandalwood who first made Sydney's money. The explorers like Matthew Flinders, the first man to circumnavigate the continent. Charles Darwin and the Beagle, and Huxley, his friend and companion. They came here. Darwin, in fact, doubted if there were a single God once he'd seen part of Australia. He said there must be two creators, one who created Australia, another who created the rest of the world. But Huxley was very different. He married a Sydney girl.
Yes, it's a unique harbour. There's no other city in Australia that has anything like it. Melbourne sits on a large bay, and the other capital cities sit on rivers. It was described by Cook, I think, as the most perfect anchorage in the world, and it surely is that.
It's quite a choppy sea, and with all those propellers churning around and so on, the royal party, the dignitaries, are perhaps having rather more uncomfortable time than they would have wished.
We've been, don't tempt fate, Alistair, we've been very blessed with the weather. This is a time of year that Sydney often gets very humid days followed by wild thunderstorms, and we've had a few in the last few weeks. They can be very frightening with lightning striking all around you, and it's a perfect day. Couldn't possibly be better.
Don't you think you ought to have some traffic police in Port Jackson?
Well, there are some water police, but I think they've probably given up and gone home. I think the barges, if it's an old Royal Naval construction, is very soundly built and is quite capable of crushing anything that gets in its way, as long as it's not a Sydney ferry. So I'm sure their Royal Highnesses will get to Admiralty House in good order.
Of course, the ferries are free today, and they're plying right through the harbour in every direction. The point is, though, if you get on a ferry, they clear it once it comes into the quay side, so that you just can't occupy the rail and see the whole thing for free throughout the show. Well, this is the harbour, of course, from which the Cutty's Sark, which used to berth in Circular Quay, and the Thermopylae, the great clipper ships which set off on their races. 73 days it was then to win a race from Sydney to England. And now, of course, everyone comes by plane, or, like the First Fleet, laboriously, but now triumphantly, 7 or 8 months.
It's also a harbour where for well over 100 years Australian servicemen have set off to help defend Britain and the British Empire around the world. Indeed, my own grandfather, as a young man, rode his horse down to Sydney, enlisted in the Australian Light Horse, and set off to defend the British Empire and the Palestine. And,
well, there is a little plaque at Man of War Steps, which was taken over by the Royal Australian Navy in 1913, and they left, as you say, Malcolm, for 2 world wars, and to serve in Korea, Malaya, and Vietnam. And the plaque says, "You who tread their footsteps, remember their story."
Yes, indeed. Well, that's a story that will never be forgotten.
And now we're coming in to Admiralty House. That's where Prime Minister Hawke has been staying, we understand.
That's not actually his house, though, Alistair. Admiralty House is the Sydney residence of the Governor-General, and it's a very grand house. And just on the other side of the garden is a very attractive cottage called Kirribilli House, which is the Prime Minister's official residence in Sydney, because both of them have their principal residences in Canberra, the nation's capital. Interestingly enough, neither the Governor-General nor the Prime Minister have an official residence in Melbourne. So Sydney and Canberra are the only
Well,
places.
Melbourne can't like that.
No, it's a source of great discontent. But you can see here what a fine building with the half a dozen chimneys Admiralty House is.
I think this is time just to complete our coverage of the Aboriginal reaction to what is going on. There is Mrs. Macquarie's Point, looking now, many of them Aboriginals, at the reconstructed First Fleet which is here. And now here's a report by Jeremy Thompson.
The Aborigines had no celebrations in mind as they marched on Sydney early this morning. Their demand is for a right to the land they believe is theirs. Aborigines from all across Australia had gathered in Sydney to protest about what they see as 200 years of injustice. For them, the bicentennial is a year of mourning, from their ancestors who perished in the early years of white settlement through to the present deaths in police custody. A line of police waited to stop them entering the city.
Hold your ground, don't move backwards.
It was the Aborigines who held their ground. A sit-down protest finally persuaded the police to let them through, even though the march was illegal. Several hundred Aborigines eventually gathered on the harbour side. For them, it was a political platform. Though for most white Australians, it was just a natural grandstand to watch the festivities. For the Aborigines, Australia Day is a make-or-break day, probably the biggest chance they've ever had to bring their grievances to the notice of a world outside Australia. To make the point, they conducted their own version of the First Fleet reenactment, tipping 3 white sympathisers into the harbour. It was a humorous moment, but carrying a very serious message. Now back to Alistair.
Jeremy, we're looking now at Mrs. Macquarie's Point, where the Aboriginal embassy, as they call it, the tent embassy, has been for the past week. Well, now, Malcolm, is this something which the outside world, Mr. John Pilger perhaps in particular, has been overplaying? Is this important?
Well, I think John Pilger's overplayed it as much as anyone possibly could. The Aboriginals were certainly dispossessed here.
Malcolm, we've just gone to Melbourne, where there's a super swim, 600 swimmers in the River Yarra. So Melbourne, I think it's quite right. Even you will agree we have to give them the opportunity to join in this centenary celebration.
Rob Woodhouse, for the second year in a row, has won the super swim.
Well, many people used to think of Australia as a place where sport flourished, but now, as you've been saying, there is also a political entity. There's political problems and resolutions which Australia can bring about and has to bring about in the coming years.
Yes, indeed, that's right. Australians can't afford to be hedonistic and disregarding of the important political issues that face them, and there's no doubt that the Aboriginal issue is one of them.
I was saying that 50 years ago, Melbourne and other towns weren't particularly interested, but they clearly are this time round. 200 years is a good round figure, and this is a very good round turnout from the huge cruise ships from Fort Denison in the center, the Martello Tower put up, well, first of all, out of fear of the Russians, to all this great host and company of small craft. And just before us in Farm Cove, well, there's the ferries absolutely loaded down with privileged spectators. Malcolm, it has been a celebration which appears to have gone off well. There appears to have been no violence or difficulty about the Aboriginal protest.
No, that seems to have worked out very well.
What can Mr. Hawke do? I mean, he said that he was going to work towards a charter or some arrangement of some kind. Would that actually put Australia under the United Nations or a United Nations body?
No, look, there are some very distinct issues about Aboriginals. You see, you have some Aboriginals living in the Northern Territory and in the outback who are by and large full-blood Aboriginals to whom have been given land rights, who are still living in Aboriginal communities. But most of these Aboriginals you see in Sydney today are a quarter or an eighth Aboriginal. They've been living in urban environments for a long time, and they've lost, they are as much Aboriginal in the sense compared to their colleagues in the outback as I might be an Irishman if I had an Irish great-grandfather.
And so, Sydney Harbour. Modern Australia has lived and grown for 200 years, and it's probably still going to have difficulty working out what it has to do for an encore after today. For 150 years, it was more British than the British, loyal and true, and defended by the Royal Navy. Its investment then came from Britain. It used British technology, it bought British, it fought in Britain's wars. And now, in a sense, it's on its own, finding a style of its own, 16 million people making a living on the edge of Asia. They were once the quiet continent. They were once the lucky country. They suspect it isn't quite true anymore, but they're still celebrating. And we'll still be celebrating when you in Britain have to get up. Good morning from Sydney.
For Australians, crocodiles are the most feared animals on the continent, for the very good reason that every year crocodiles eat a lot of Australians. But since the movie Crocodile Dundee, the brutes have entered Australian folklore and become a tourist attraction. Up here near Darwin in the Northern Territory, there's even a crocodile farm for tourists and for breeding and for commerce. A difficult one for the Prince, this, since as a conservationist he was about to tour a place which, not to put too fine a point on it, is a handbag farm.
It's really a side restaurant. Initially they get like that. And these are all huts here.
It's these 3-year-olds which, according to the authorities, make the best handbags, shoes and wallets. Even when small, they're not the most patable of creatures. Tickling on the tummy is safe enough. Anything more adventurous could be dangerous too. The princess had one moment of fantasy. She was told even the week-old hatchlings could take your finger off. Feeding the big ones represents the time of maximum danger for the keepers. They can never be sure that this is the day when the croc finally gets fed up with chicken and seeks a change of diet. Wisely, the princess was not offered a handbag. Controversy was avoided, and she settled for 2 cuddly crocs in rather dreadful day glow. But now it was time to leave the Northern Territory of Australia and journey on to Southeast Asia, to Less than a quarter of a mile from the centre of Bangkok, the old way of life of the Thai people continues virtually unchanged along the canals. In the city centre, every traffic light is the beginning of a Bangkok Grand Prix. The traffic problem is the worst in Asia, possibly the world. Pollution is horrendous, hanging like a blue curtain in the humid air. Getting to and from work is something of a nightmare. The city's population is about 6 million, though no one wants a census in case it turns out to be much more. And around all these people, the city has sprawled quite without control or planning. It is not, therefore, a pretty place, except perhaps when the sunset softens the outline. Nightfall for the Thais means going out to eat. There are over 50,000 restaurants in Bangkok, one for every 100 people. This is the biggest, Tump Nak Thai. It takes 3,000 people at a sitting, covers 10 acres, has 350 cooks. Surprisingly, for this scale of place, the food is very good. On the lake stage, the Thai dancing goes on all evening. Very decorous, but the catering system requires not classic but modern aids to service. Occasionally, there is the most awful crash. The arrival at Bangkok Airport was ceremonial in a uniquely Thai way. The umbrella carriers are there to shield royal heads, and only royal heads, a task they accomplished professionally, the Crown Prince Vajiralongkorn and Princess Maha Chakri Sirinorn, who are to be the escorts for the Waleses on this visit. The guests spotted the garlanded steps, then moved down gratefully towards the shade of the brollies. Both were given Phuang Ma Lai, hand garlands, as a sign of welcome. Ritual says that you shouldn't give them back to your host. By the same token, you can't cart a garland around a guard of honor. With the princess thinking brollies might have come in handy in Australia, they moved off for drinks in the VIP lounge. Here they discovered that royals are treated with a reverence undreamed of in the House of Windsor. The waiters are on their knees because their heads must not be higher than royal heads. So it is decreed in the Kingdom of Siam. It didn't go unnoticed on this occasion that the two princes are in a similar situation, both waiting for thrones that could be long years away. The Grand Palace and the Wat Phra Keo, the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, are the heart of Bangkok, the place where King Rama I founded his capital city in the late 18th century. Here in one place are both the focus of reverence for the Thai monarchy and the most holy of Buddhist shrines in the entire nation. It was completely restored 30 years ago to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the death of Buddha, and now glows with its original glory. To worship here is to gain merit. To visit here is to find a sort of understanding of the religion that dominates this country. And these visitors had just on an hour for the experience. They did not remove their shoes, as is customary, when they reached the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. Apparently, the king always grants a dispensation to his most honored guests. The princess seemed to think this was a funny place to put the visitors' book. But this is where the signing was done, the servant kneeling to keep his head below the prince's. It was decided that to give them lunch and the faint chance of a cooling breeze, a cruise on the Chao Phraya River would be a good idea. The princess displayed a mosquito bite on her arm and a general sense of relief that the tourism, however exalted, was over for the morning. The cruise launch River Queen pulled away and headed for the center stream. There was one last chance for the classic tourist view of the Grand Palace and the Emerald Temple from the river, one of the great images of Bangkok. The Prince is vice patron of the British Council and very much a fan of the work it does overseas. He met a group of Thai agricultural students learning English before they go to Australia as postgraduates in Perth.
It's a lovely place. We like it. Some very good surfing, as you can see. And sharks.
He couldn't resist doing his own small commercial.
So you think the British Council is doing a good job? Yes. You know, I'm a vice patron. I'm very proud of it. I think they do a marvelous job.
Outside, he met some ordinary Thais, something of a rarity on this visit, and he showed he knew the correct Thai gesture of greeting, sawadi. The old folk playing petanque are at a remedial center sponsored by Help the Aged. The therapy seems to work most effectively. The princess, who is patron of the charity, was inside the center watching the remedial demonstrations. But she'd heard about the game of petanque and wanted to join in. She was hoping that she didn't do a back-in like this poor man. First, there was a little instruction in the subtleties. Then a preliminary throw. And then she rather took over the game. Not a bad effort, though. Then to the purpose of this visit, to call on the King of Thailand to congratulate him on his 60th birthday. King Phumibol is now the longest-serving sovereign in the history of the Chakri dynasty, which began in 1782. He married Queen Sirikit in 1950, and they have 4 children. He is somewhat autocratic by our standards of a constitutional monarch, but he's held together the Thai nation through the turmoil created in Southeast Asia by the Vietnam War. The birthday celebrations will last a year, but the Great River ceremonial was 2 months ago on the birthday itself. Then a fleet of royal barges was rowed up the Chao Phraya River. It was all pure King and I, though that is something I shouldn't mention because the King disapproves of the movie, liked Deborah Kerr, hated Yul Brynner. The music is banned here. The old Grand Palace is where the Crown Prince gave a dinner for his guests, and for it the Princess chose her most stunning dress of the entire tour. It was one of those occasions where not only did she look good, she knew she looked good. She'd also done her homework and knew the lotus blossom was the symbol of Thailand. Down the grand staircase they processed. The Thais are very keen on formality for these functions. And so to dinner. It was Thai cuisine, but not too spicy. On the last day, they flew north from Bangkok to an even more ancient capital of Thailand, Chiang Mai, set in a fertile plain of rice paddies and circled by hills of teak forests. On the almost scalding tarmac stood 300 barefoot girls, lined up in the colors of the stripes of the national flag. The people of the hill country had brought many bouquets and garlands, and there was much kneeling and bowing. The reverence for royalty seemed even more marked up here. The dancing girls knelt on the hot tarmac, one of them showing how difficult it is to mop her brow with those fingernails. Once the royals were installed on the balcony, the dance could begin. This is called Phon Muang and is performed only for royal visitors. At the end, they spelt out the letters of the word welcome. The princess was taken to the Bosang umbrella factory, which started as a small handicraft shop, but has been cleverly developed into a worldwide export business. Once again, a ripple of curtsies went along the line. Right away, she was given a sample and told how, 200 years ago, people presented umbrellas to the hill monasteries on Buddhist festivals. The paper coverings are made from the beaten bark of mulberry trees and made waterproof by mixing glue with the juice of the persimmon fruit. The frames are always made from bamboo, including the catch. The painters are taught by tradition rather than art school, and they make it look so easy. The princess was given another 10 umbrellas, including a giant greetings brolly, which was rather over the top, though it could be said that that's what brollies are all about. Then to a Thai silk factory, which also has international renown, and interested her because of its fashion potential. She decided to buy a few things, so she borrowed a credit card from her detective and ordered a couple of silk shirt lengths, a cotton jumpsuit, and, since it's her birth sign, a crab-shaped cushion. All through this visit to Chiang Mai, there was a considerable army presence wherever the princess went. This is not to say she was in any danger, but the Thais, conscious of their various border troubles with Burma and Laos, not far from here, were taking no chances. Nearer still to the Burmese border is one of the King of Thailand's favorite projects. 80,000 acres of lakes and farmland designed to provide new crops for the hill tribe farmers and lure them away from growing opium. This is the edge of the Golden Triangle. The prince's car door was opened by a kneeling man as he began a visit already experienced by the King of Spain and the Crown Prince of Japan. All the big royal names are brought up here. Still, he must rate quite highly since he got 3 hand garlands. That's top-ranking stuff. The fishermen spied strangers. The prince was taken through the estate to the lake, a vast reservoir with 180 small dams to hold the hill water. It's stocked with freshwater prawns and species of river fish never before seen in the far north. The afternoon's catch was duly displayed. It was explained that the hard part is to turn opium farmers into lake fishermen. But the prince's eye was taken with the odd form of vessel used by this tribesman, a sort of large inner tube.
And they can paddle around in those yes. In a tube. It's difficult to do in England, the water's too small.
Then he began a tour of the market gardening land where experimental crops are being grown. The ladies with the watering cans seem to be a bit put off their aim. Things like mangoes, lychees, sweet corn and mushrooms are all being tried up here for the first time. He met a group of hill farmers who trekked 20 miles and waited 8 hours to see him.
How are they all people doing this year?
ปีนี้ผลผลิตเป็นยังไง This year the harvest is very good. Rice, we grow rice and onion and also garlic.
Garlic?
Garlic.
Do you eat the garlic?
Then he said goodbye to the dignitaries and waved to the hill farmers' children who'd also been waiting there for 8 hours. And so the prince left this remote spot, which he's not likely to see again. And the fishermen? Well, they went back to their normal life, until the next royal visit, of course.